Okay, good morning, everyone. So hopefully you can hear me just fine. I was having some computer glitchy things this morning, so I'm hoping that is the end of it and that everything is going to be just fine for class. Just please message me or put something in the chat if there are some computer issues, and hopefully we can resolve all the problems this morning. So today I'm actually in the biology lab. I think I turned everything off that's making too much noise, so I'm hoping that it's not going to get too bad in here. I'm just hoping there's a good Wi-Fi signal as well, so that we can do the lecture in here. I wanted to show you some specimens, some worms, and a few other things today, and that's why I'm in the biology lab. So before we get to the worms, we got to finish talking about the fungi. And I know we just started talking about fungi. I told you a joke or two. And so I kind of want to get back into talking about the fungi. So first thing is I kind of left off here, and I had mentioned that fungi are generally decomposers. Many of them are parasites, and they're going to grow on plants and animals. And they're very similar to animals in that they eat food, they digest things, but the difference is they don't bring things in internally to their digestive system. The difference is they secrete enzymes. And a lot of mushrooms have these structures, and you can see they're on that diagram there. They're called mycelium and hyphae. And these hyphae are like, they're kind of like little fingers, and they get into things, and they have digestive enzymes. And so if you've ever had a fungal infection, such as athlete's foot or something like that, that's these hyphae. They're kind of just penetrating, getting into your skin a little bit. They're secreting enzymes, and that's causing the itchiness. So if you have a bundle of these hyphae, they're called mycelium. So some words for you to learn. A couple more words around that. There's some pictures of these hyphae, and trying to show these structures. Often you can see these structures under a microscope, and my understanding is this is one way that you can identify the different types of fungi, is that they all have kind of slightly different branching structures, but I'm not really sure. Not really a mycologist, so I can't tell you quite the answer to that. There's another picture just showing some different types. You can see A and B there. I'm looking right here and here. So fungi do a lot of weird things. Some of them are a little bit more like animals and plants, where they have their individual cells. Some fungi actually, they kind of start undergoing mitosis, but then they don't do that final stage where they separate the cytoplasm. So they have these large sections which have numerous nuclei, which is kind of interesting. You can see on the bottom here, you can see that this fungal cell is invading, it looks like some sort of plant, and it's invading it with its hyphae and mycelium. Sometimes we use another word as well. You can see down there, Haustorium, or up top, Haustoria. These are basically mycelium or hyphae, but the word is usually used with parasitic fungi as well. So 3 words to know. So this was something that I learned about a few years ago. There was, believe it or not, there's an X-Files episode. And if you haven't seen the X-Files, interesting show. They have sometimes kind of a monster of the week kind of thing going on. And in this one episode, there was this predatory fungi that was killing people. And I was like, are you crazy? Is that for real? And it turns out, actually, yeah, there aren't large ones that will kill humans, but there are predatory fungi that are found in the soil, and they will actually snare worms, which is kind of like crazy. They snare the worm goes through the loop, and then it just starts digesting the worm with its Haustoria. So crazy stuff. Okay. So a little bit more about fungi is there's different types, different growth forms, and these are usually the common words that we use in English to describe different types of fungi. So we talk about mushrooms and puffballs, or we might talk about molds or yeasts, and I'm going to introduce one other type called the dimorphic type of fungi. So fleshy mushrooms, these are the things that we see. Sometimes they grow on our lawn. Sometimes we eat them on our pizza. And there's many, many very interesting and beautiful forms of these things. Probably somebody told you at one point, hey, don't eat mushrooms if you don't know much about them, and that's probably a good idea. There's good news and bad news about eating mushrooms. The good news is that not many are actually poisonous. Actually, only a small percentage of mushrooms are actually poisonous. The bad news is the ones that are poisonous are really poisonous. Many of them will kill you, like this one here. This is the death cap mushroom. We don't have them, as far as I know, this far north, but I think it is found in parts of British Columbia. This death cap mushroom is found all sorts of places worldwide. And so you don't want to eat that one. Anything with the name death cap in it, you definitely do not want to eat that thing. But yeah, I know lots of people who collect mushrooms and eat them, and I guess they must know something about them because they're still alive. Why can I not advance to the next slide? There we go, my computer's frozen, it looks like. So let me see what we can do here. Okay, well that's great. I can't do anything. My entire keyboard is frozen. I'm not really sure what to do here. Okay, so I don't know if you are still there, but I'm going to try to turn my computer off and turn it back on, so you'll have to rejoin the Zoom meeting if that. Okay, maybe we're in good shape here. I think I have the Zoom meeting still up, so I'll get back to mushrooms and just get the PowerPoint back up and running. Sorry about that. I see there's a few people saying it's working now. Yep, okay. All right, let's just share the screen, go back to the death cap mushrooms. There we go. So we're not going to talk a lot about mushrooms, by the way. They're not usually causing infections, although some of them may make us sick. The ones that we're concerned about include molds. So you can see there's a mold there. Molds are obviously very important when we're looking at the food industry because they're causing all sorts of spoilage. You might see a different spelling of mold, right? So sometimes people throw a U in there. I'm not actually sure which is the best way to spell it. I'm guessing maybe the U is the British way, and without the U is the American way. And of course, us being Canadians, what do? You know, we're indecisive about our spelling, I guess. So I'm fine with either, and so you can feel free to use either. Some of these molds, by the way, are important actually for medicines. So we're going to talk a little bit about penicillin. And penicillin comes from a mold called Penicillium, which is the source of penicillin, which is a great thing. There's another mold. I thought this was actually a really cool picture. Molds tend to be quite fuzzy, and that's because of all those little myceliums in there. And you can imagine they're, like I said, they're kind of like microscopic, tiny little fingers, and so they look usually fuzzy. Somebody's saying here, what kind of molds cause illness? We're going to talk about some of these dimorphic fungi, which are sort of mold-like sometimes. Those are the biggest ones we're concerned about. And some people, of course, have mold allergies as well, which is something we're a little bit concerned about for human health. So if you take a look, this is kind of showing what's happening with a mold. Molds usually form these spores, and again, people can inhale these spores and sometimes get them in their lungs. And these spores are kind of like little seeds that can float around in the air currents. And then when they form these myceliums, they can start looking really fuzzy. In fact, a bunch of these a bunch of these molds are actually very beautiful under a microscope. You can see there's the penicillium mold there, and it's actually very cool. It looks like some sort of alien tree. Someone's asking questions, says roughly how long would it take a tomato to get to that stage? We're not really sure, but I know sometimes mold seems to grow really fast, you know, in my fridge, and then other times not so fast. So I think it has a lot to do with humidity and things like that. Molds tend to grow not quite as fast at body temperature, like 37. They seem to more like room temperature or cooler temperatures, which is why they seem to thrive really well in your fridge. They seem to do just fine at those cooler temperatures. Probably humidity and moisture has something to do with it as well. So there's also, we have yeast as a fungal growth form. This is supposed to be a video. Oh, there we go. I've got the video going. So yeast are basically unicellular fungi, and they're kind of like, they're just single cells. The interesting thing about yeast is they reproduce by something called budding. So they reproduce asexually, and if you take a look at that video, you can see what's happening is you have sort of the parent yeast cell, and it sort of does a little mitosis, and the daughter cell is smaller. Rather than dividing equally in the middle, it divides its DNA and makes the daughter cell smaller, and it sort of buds off eventually. You can see that diagram in the top there, where all those little those bud scars are forming, and that's where the daughter cell escaped from. So yeast is one of the ones that we are concerned about medically, and you've probably heard of yeast infections. There are different types of yeast infections, usually given different types of names depending on the body part. So the yeast that causes the infection is called Candida albicans. So the infection, sometimes we call it a yeast infection, or sometimes we call it candidiasis. The main two types of yeast infections are vaginal yeast infections, which are often just called yeast infections, or vaginitis. Vaginitis doesn't necessarily mean a yeast infection. It means an inflammation of the vagina. There are bacterial vaginitis that people can get. But the most common type is probably from yeast, from Candida. When we get it on the mouth, we call it thrush. Does anyone know who usually gets thrush? Anyone know the answer to that? I see some people putting in the chat, and they're saying babies and kids.
Babies?
Yeah. So it turns out that babies are pretty common, and mostly it has to do with being newborn. So when you're a newborn baby, you're not really fully colonized by bacteria, and that takes time. It takes months. So if you get colonized by yeast a little quicker than being colonized by bacteria, the yeast can kind of overgrow, and that kind of thing happens relatively frequently. Another scenario where people get thrush is where they're ill for some other reason. So, you know, maybe they're immunocompromised because maybe they, somebody has a comment here about her husband and roommate got yeast infections all over their mouths and down their throats in college from not fully fermenting the beer they were making. Yeah, that's actually a different kind of yeast, but I have heard of that. It's kind of funny. It's just basically growing. You know, the mouth is a rich, moist place, lots of food, good place for these things to grow. But like I said, people that are immunocompromised, so sometimes people with AIDS get thrush. And again, they're looking at their immune system is not functioning properly. They've got an imbalance of the normal microbial complement, and things are just a little bit messed up. So somebody's asking about women being prone to yeast infections when you're on antibiotics. And yeah, that actually was my next point, was that that's kind of a pretty common scenario for women who to get yeast infections is maybe they're ill for some other reason. So maybe they have pneumonia or something, and they get antibiotics, and the antibiotics basically clear the bacteria, the good and the bad. And of course, yeast are not bacteria, and so they get a chance to kind of grow and overgrow, and then cause the yeast infection. Yeast is part of our normal flora, by the way, and it just has a chance to, like I said, kind of overgrow in some circumstances. Most women will have at least one yeast infection in their lifetime, and many will have them a bit more. than that. And like I said, a lot of it has to do with just your imbalance in your bacterial flora. So anything that can throw it off, other illnesses or taking antibiotics or all sorts of things. Somebody's asking about pregnant women prone to yeast infections. I don't fully know the answer as to why, but when you're pregnant, you know, your body chemistry is doing weird things, it's changing, and sometimes those changes can alter the bacterial flora. The vagina in particular tends to be an acidic environment, and so little changes in body chemistry can change that acidity and allow, you know, to become slightly more neutral or alkaline. That's an opportunity for yeast to have a chance to grow. And so, you know, that's something that can happen. Somebody else has a comment. She says, a prof I had last year said he had a case where a patient was chewing their antibiotics, which caused a crazy case of oral thrush. Yeah, so it makes sense, right? The person is killing the bacteria in their mouth and allowing the yeast to overgrow. So these things happen. Mostly, we're not looking at anything life-threatening. Discharges and itchiness in both mouth and vagina. So these things are uncomfortable and unpleasant, but not usually life-threatening. So we will come back to talk about yeast and yeast infections. Someone says you can get it on your nipples too if the baby is breastfed and gets thrush. It can be painful. Yeah, of course. So the infant is spreading it to the human's skin, or the mother's skin, of course. So there are, by the way, a bunch of other yeast out there that can be very dangerous to get. Most of them are pretty rare. This is one that I hear about every once in a while. This is a type of yeast found in pigeon feces. I'm not entirely sure in this case whether you have to be immunocompromised or not, but there's usually every year, you hear about this in the news about homeless people or street people getting these infections. And, you know, there's two things going on there. They're immunocompromised in many cases. And also, sometimes they're not living in the best of environments where there are lots of pigeons. You know, pigeons, you know, I lived in one apartment many years ago where there were pigeons, and they're pretty filthy animals. Their feces can get certainly everywhere, and you can imagine how easy it would be to inhale some of the spores. But again, this is pretty rare, and like I said, I'm not entirely sure whether it's because you have to be immunocompromised to get this or not. Okay, so the last form of fungi that I want to talk about are called dimorphic. So morphic means shape, and di means two. So you can see from the description on the slide here, it says these organisms, they grow yeast-like at one temperature and mold-like at another temperature. So yeast-like at body temperature and mold-like at lower temperatures. So 25 degrees, that's kind of typical, you know, room temperatures, 20 to 25 degrees. The big one that we're concerned about the most is this one here called Blastomyces. And this one is found all over the place. I think I have a map here. There's a map. You can see it's found all over the place, and it's just an environmental pathogen. It's found in rotten wood, and I think it's found in the soil. So it looks like we might be just out of the range here in Fort McMurray, but of course, you know, people do travel all over the place. And so, you know, people can get this just from the environment. They can inhale it, and they can get in their lungs, and it can be actually a very, very serious disease. This is the type of thing that, you know, people living in condemned buildings were very worried about. They get mold in there, and if they get the blastomyces, like I said, in the lungs, it can be very debilitating. Anything you get in the lungs can be very dangerous in many cases. So dimorphic, two types of shapes, yeast-like and mold-like. You can see there I've actually written mold in the other spelling. So somebody says here she had a grandfather who died from blastomycoses because the doctors didn't diagnose it fast enough. Yeah, and particularly elderly people, you know, their lungs are not as strong and as you know, as healthy as young people, and you know, that's pretty common for elderly people to die of lung infections, whether it's pneumonia or the flu or blastomycoses, because of just weaker lungs, particularly if it's not caught quickly enough. So if you see this term, mycoses, that means, you know, some sort of fungal infection. And the reality is with fungal infections, there's so many different types of fungi, and many of them are never actually diagnosed. They just say it's a fungal infection, and they call them mycoses. It's very, very common to not diagnose most fungal infections. Most fungal infections are people get something on the skin, like athlete's foot. Pretty easy to recognize. You prescribe an antifungal, and that's usually the end of the story. And like I said, you know, I would say a good 90% of fungal infections are not serious. And then, unfortunately, there are some that are, and that's where you know, often they're diagnosed a little late in some cases. So you can see here's some terms that are used. Often have to do with the body part. Cutaneous, meaning usually to do with the skin. Subcutaneous, meaning a little bit deeper. Systemic, of course, means you know, even deeper into the body, often into the internal organs in the blood or the lymphatic system. Here are some of the common fungal forms. You don't need to know these. I'm not going to. The only one I'll ask you about are the ones that I've mentioned already, right? So you can see we have. Oops. I'm going to circle that. We've got blastomyces, candida. We are going to talk about histoplasma, but not today. That's going to be like much later on in the semester. But the other names, don't worry about. But you can see there's this chart here. I think this is from the textbook, and you know they're showing that, you know, there's all these different growth forms. Most of them have hyphae that's helping them to be pathogenic. Some are. Many of the ones you can see, Candida is an opportunistic pathogen. That means it's not usually causing you to be sick, but sometimes it gets the right opportunity and it causes thrush or vaginitis. A bunch of these other ones are systemic. Like I said, they can get into the body, into other parts, and cause serious infections, but they're usually not that common for healthy individuals, which is the good news. So another term to know, I'm sorry for all these terms, this is just the reality of the situation, but another term is Taenia. So you can see that means a skin mycosis. And there's many types of these things that happen, and often they are, we name them after the body part, right? So athlete's foot, right? You can see is the common name for Taenia pedis, which, you know, is kind of the scientific term, but I think probably most people use the term athlete's foot. Someone's just mentioning that maybe this signal is a little weak, so I apologize for that. Hopefully it improves. You can see there's other ones there, jock itch, and Taenia corporis, which is the arms and legs, and so on. Okay, I just see there's another question here. Someone says, try unplugging your headphones. Okay. So another one to know is this one here, this term here, ringworm. Oops. So that's a good term to know. And this just means it's generally a fungal skin infection, and sometimes they form these kind of ring-like rashes. And so it's not a worm, this is a fungus, just another name for the ringworm. Just want to point on the left, you can see the athlete's foot. You know, things get red from the scratching, and sometimes there's sort of a, you know, a pasty-looking film that ends up on the infected area as well. Sorry, I'm just having some issues with my mouse again for some reason. Someone says, can you flip back to the previous slide for a second? Sure can. There we go. I think that's the one they're looking for. So I was just going to say, you know, usually with these infections, they're pretty common. A lot of people will get them within their lifetime, and sometimes people don't even get it treated. I've had athlete's foot a few times. There was, I can't even remember how many years in a row, 3 or 4 years in a row. It was like clockwork every spring. So kind of May, June, I was getting athlete's foot. And so, you know, that time of year, you know, there's more moisture in the air, probably the, you know, fungi from the environment. And, you know, that's the time I'm out and about a bit more often and wearing my shoes all day and all evening long. And in some cases, I did go and get a treatment for that, and it cleared up kind of within a day. Other years, just a matter of, you know, I recognize, oh, my feet are kind of itchy, and so, you know, I dry my shoes out and use a different pair of shoes just in case. So, you know, now that I've had it a couple of times, I kind of watch for that. If my feet are starting to get itchy or something, I start thinking about it, and then I just use a different pair of shoes and dry out the ones I have really well. And I haven't had it a number of years now, which is good because it really sucks being itchy. So ringworm, as I mentioned, is mostly just describing the rash. These are fungal infections. Several different species, again, we're looking at being involved and not usually diagnosed. Usually they just give someone an antifungal and it can clear up. Sometimes it's relatively minor. Other times you can see this person has it really bad. That's quite the infection. So somebody is just saying that they had ringworm a few months ago and it was just a little ring on the back of the arm, cleared up with antifungal cream. And that, in most cases, seems to be the case. You know, if you notice a rash, get it checked out. If you want to leave it and then get as bad as this person's arm, that's up to you. But usually it's a good idea if you have a rash that's not clearing after a few days to get it checked out. You never know what it is. Okay, so almost done with the fungi. I have a little case study here for you. You can see it's talking about, there's a 37-year-old man and he has AIDS and he's admitted to the hospital. And he has some symptoms such as a fever and weight loss. And they do a bone marrow examination. There's probably a little bit more to the case study as to why they're doing the bone marrow examination. But in the bone marrow, you can see in figure 1, they stained it with something called methylene blue, and they see something that looks like yeast. How do they know it's yeast? Kind of the shape and size. It's usually pretty obvious, particularly to technicians who've kind of done these kind of stains before. So they gave the patient something called amphotericin B, that's an antifungal, and they culture the organism. And so you can see the organism is being cultured at 30 degrees Celsius, and the organism is kind of looking fuzzy. So a couple of questions here. It says, what are dimorphic fungi? So dimorphic fungi are exactly this scenario, where you have at one temperature, so at body temperature, it's growing yeast-like, and at lower temperatures, so usually room temperature, in this case they're using 30 degrees, it's growing kind of mold-like, it's a little fuzzy looking. Question 2, why is it significant that the patient has AIDS? That's hugely significant because, of course, people with AIDS, it means their immune system is having issues. It's not running at 100%. And it makes them way more susceptible to all sorts of infections. I don't see an identification for this particular fungi, but with AIDS patients, there are all sorts of fungal infections that most people don't normally get because our immune system can fight it off. In the case of AIDS patients, there are all sorts of fungal infections that they may get because their immune system is not up and running 100%. And can't fight them off. So this infection could be very serious for the individual and needs to be dealt with. Okay, so that's kind of the end of this unit. Remember we were talking about protists, so know the examples, don't worry about the groups. The characteristics, hopefully the characteristics kind of help you remember a little bit about these organisms. So like Giardia, remember, has 2 nuclei. Kind of looks like a little alien. Unfortunately, lots of scientific names there. Some of them do have common names, like Giardia, again, is beaver fever. The trypanosomes, you can see I don't have them both listed here, but there's 2 trypanosomes. One is causing sleeping sickness, and the other causes Chagas disease. So make sure you know the examples. As before, I found these websites that have these pronunciation stations. So if you don't know how to say the organism name, you can go there and there's a little audio clip that shows you how to say it. A lot of these things, by the way, you can find on YouTube as well. There are people that have graciously put little videos about how to say the names of pathogens. Someone has a question that says, know the examples as the proper name or the common names. You should know both, the common names and the binomial scientific names. Okay, so that is it for fungi and protists. So slightly behind schedule here. I'm going to switch now. We want to talk about worms. I know this is why everybody is here today. They want to talk about the worms. So let me just get that PowerPoint up. Okay. Looks like it's ready to go. Just got to share that screen. There we go. Okay. So we're going to talk about worms today and a few other things. I kind of grouped them into this category of multicellular eukaryotic parasites. So it's worth it to talk about what is a parasite, because the word is used loosely all the time, right? A parasite technically means study of, parasitology technically means study of parasites, and a parasite is technically anything that is growing on you at your expense. So that it could include bacteria, that could include viruses and other things. Medically though, when we talk about parasitology, we're really talking about two things. Medically, we're talking about protists, protozoa, and metazoa. So the protists are those things that we talked about in the last unit. So the Giardia, the Cryptosporidium, the trypanosomes. So sometimes people go and they come back and they say, I got a parasite, and maybe it was Giardia, and that would be a correct medical term to use. They had traveler's diarrhea from E. coli. Usually medically, we don't say it is a parasite, but technically it is. Just medically, usually when we say parasites, we are referring to the protists or worms. So metazoa, what does metazoa mean? Metazoa, again, is kind of a funny term that's not really used by biologists, but is often used in the medical literature, usually to refer to worms, but it can refer to you know, almost any animal really. But usually it's referring to worms and a few other kind of creepy crawly type of parasites. Every once in a while it might refer to an insect or something like that. Parasitology includes endoparasites and ectoparasites. So endo means inside, so you can see that guy there in the diagram. He's got a worm inside his gut. Ectoparasites mean things on the outside, so that might include things like lice. So we'll talk about lice kind of at the end of today's topic. Hopefully we'll get to that today. Okay, so I have this broken down into the worms and the arthropods. So a scientific term for worms is a helminth. So if you see that term, it means worm. Sometimes there's you know, might be a suffix onto that word, but if you see that word helminth, it means a worm. So we're looking at really different types of worms. The big category we're going to talk about are the flatworms. That includes tapeworms and something called flukes. And we're also going to talk about nematodes. Nematodes are roundworms, and they come in many shapes and sizes as well. And we'll talk a little bit about the segmented roundworms as well. So that includes things like leeches. And then we're going to talk about some insects. So that includes lice, and there's a few other arthropods, so arachnids we can mention as well. Ticks and mites, those are important organisms. So let's talk about these flatworms. So are these microbes? These can be massive. So take a look at this one here. This particular worm was taken out of a fish, and the worm is almost the same size as the fish. These can be massive, massive organisms, but they do fall under the category of microbiology because most of them do have microscopic stages. Their eggs can be very, very, very tiny, and they just happen to grow very large, or at least some of them do. Many of them are microscopic as well, and they infect us and can cause all sorts of disease and illness. So some more definitions for you. I kind of mentioned this a little bit when we were talking about Plasmodium and malaria, and a little bit about toxoplasma. But I want to kind of get into talking about life cycles of some of these organisms. Many of these organisms have multiple hosts, and this is how they live. It's really kind of an amazing thing to think about. Like, you know, if you think about most organisms, they kind of grow. You know, you put your plant in the soil, and that's kind of the end of the story. But a lot of parasites, they have to have different stages in different organisms. And so we talk about different hosts, and you can see I have two terms there, a definitive host and an intermediate host. So let's talk about what that means, right? So a definitive host. This is the host organism where the parasite reaches sexual maturity. So this is kind of like where the adult form of the worm or whatever it is going to be. So in the case of Plasmodium, malaria, the mosquito is actually the definitive host. In the mosquito's salivary gland, that is where the organisms actually reproduce sexually. So they change they trade their DNA. They go from haploid to diploid. All those things you learn about in high school biology, but just at a microscopic level. So the intermediate host, this is another host, and in this organism, the worm or the parasite undergoes another stage. So usually a larval kind of stage, or some sort of immature form. So it may grow, develop, it may reproduce asexually there. So the human, in the case of malaria, is the intermediate host. So the organism can reproduce in humans in the blood and liver, but it does not reproduce sexually. It reproduces asexually for Plasmodium and malaria. So let's take a look at some examples of these kind of hosts for some flatworms. In particular, I want to talk about tapeworms. So tapeworms are very interesting organisms, and there's actually quite a few that can affect humans, but there's kind of two main ones. There's the beef tapeworm. So beef tapeworm implies something to do with cows, and there is the pork tapeworm, which has something to do with pigs. So let's talk about those. So if you take a look, both of these organisms, the definitive host are humans. So that means that these worms grow large in the human gut, and they reproduce there sexually. So they produce sperm, and they have eggs, and they self-fertilize and all that. In the case of the beef tapeworm, the intermediate host, so where the larval stage is the cow. And the pork tapeworm, where the larval stage is the pig. So there's one kind of other little footnote to this, is that with the pork tapeworm, sometimes humans can also be the intermediate host. And so don't worry about that for a minute. Let's talk about the beef tapeworm first. It's a little more simple. So how does this work? Okay, so how do you get a tapeworm? You eat undercooked meat is what you do. And you can see what's going on in that meat. In the meat, there is a larva, and the larva is sitting there, and it's in the muscle, and it can be anywhere on the body of the cow. Somebody's mentioning the tapeworm diet. We'll kind of get to that in a minute. Okay. So you can see the larva it's in the meat, right? It can be in any tissue. Like some tissues, you can see there's a note there. It says often the jaw or tongue. I'm not entirely sure why it would be in those particular organs, but apparently a little bit more frequently. And like I said, it can be anywhere in the actual cow. So let's take a look at the life cycle here. You eat the meat, and you can imagine that's going into your stomach. It's going to go into your intestine, and then as it goes through those different pH environments, the worm realizes, hey, I'm home. I've made it to a human gut. So what temperature do we need to cook our meat to? About 56 degrees. So that's the first tip for you. Cook your meat, even just a little bit, and you'll probably get rid of those tapeworms. Okay, so it goes to the human gut. It's recognizing it's in a new environment. This is the chemistry that it wants, and it grows into an adult worm. And I'll show you some actual photographs in a minute. These worms can be massive. The human intestine is like, I think it's like 5 meters. These worms can be the entire length of the human intestine. And there have been cases where some of these worms have actually folded over and been double the length of the human intestine. So I mean, like 10 meters, that's insane. You can imagine though that in even larger animals, so whales, for example, can have even larger tapeworms. It's just absolutely monstrous, some of these things. You see there's a couple of questions, let's see. Somebody's asking about eating raw meat. How do you know if you have a tapeworm? I'll mention that in a minute. And can it survive and grow to adult size in the intermediate host? No, not usually. The chemistry of a cow gut is very different than the chemistry of a human gut. So in this case here, it has to be in the human to grow to the adult form, and it has to be in a cow to be in the larval form. So you can see at the end of the life cycle here, in the human gut, the worm has these segments, and these segments get fertilized, and they're just loaded with eggs. And so the human poops it out, it just ends up in the human feces, and the eggs end up out in the environment. And so now you have the cow is eating the eggs hatch in the cow, and then they grow into this larval form, and they end up in the cow tissue. So you can see a major requirement for this is that the human feces has to go to the cows. And so this is one reason why these are not that common in Canada, because we're not usually putting our feces into farm fields. Not usually anyway. The reality is, though, worldwide, about half the human population does use human feces as fertilizer. It's a nutrient-rich substance, and for some people, that's all they have, right? And so countries where human feces is used as fertilizer does increase the risk, and obviously whether the meat is cooked or not. I'm just looking, I see there's a couple of questions or just some comments. I'll come back to that in a bit. So I'll show you some pictures of these things. Oh, there's eggs released by the feces, eggs are consumed by the cow, and then the cycle starts again when the human eats the undercooked meat. So there's some pictures. Like I said, these things can be massive. 5 meters for some of them, up to 10 meters in rare occasions where the tapeworm folds over on itself in the intestine. So if you really want to know all about tapeworms, there's an article there. You can see I have the link at the bottom, that fray.com/drugs/worm. It's a story about a man who, I think he was living in France for a while, and he got into eating steak tartare. So if you know what steak tartare is, it's kind of a ground meat. It's not cooked. Spices are added to it. Apparently it's a delicacy. I've never actually had it. My brother-in-law is really into it. So he's quite the connoisseur of food, and he talks about it all the time, but I haven't actually tried it. But anyway, he was eating raw meat, and one day, he noticed a little something, right? He's going to the bathroom, and he's like, oh my, what is going on? And what he's seeing are the segments. And so that's one way to know if you have a tapeworm. Usually people don't have a lot of symptoms having tapeworms. Losing weight, probably not. That's apparently is a bit of a myth. Sometimes people might have some gastrointestinal symptoms because there's just a little bit of blockage going on, so they might have some cramps. But in most cases, people, the only symptoms they have are seeing stuff in their stool. And so they might see it when they go to the bathroom, or they might see it in their bed, because that's when the segments are released. So the worst symptoms are psychological. You know, I mean, can you just imagine having a worm and your brain is just like, oh no, what's going on to me here? And then that's often the worst symptom is people having these. So in this case here, the guy goes to the doctor, and they take that stool sample, and they're like, yep, you have a tapeworm, and they give him a pill. It's one pill, and what it does is it paralyzes the head. They kind of hold on by their head. I'll show you some pictures of the head in a moment. And then let me just say there was a whole bunch of toilet paper, and you can read all about it in the story. It's very fascinating. Sounds, like I said, a little bit traumatic, but the guy survived, and he's doing just fine. So here's a picture of one. You can see it's a very, very long one with the ruler. Like I said, just in some ways kind of horrifying to imagine all of that coming out in one bowel movement. Sounds like fun. So here's a picture of the head. This is how they actually identify tapeworms, by the way, is they look at the head, because each of them have different types of heads. And you can see the heads have these suckers and these hooks, and that's how they hold on. And And then the rest of the worm just sort of hangs there and absorbs nutrients as you eat. And that's how they live and make a living for themselves, just absorbing nutrients while they're inside of your intestine. They have these segments here. The segments I'll show you, I kind of have a zoom in here, I think. And each segment has testes and ovaries. So basically what they do is they just self-fertilize. And I'm not sure whether one segment fertilizes itself or whether the sperm that are released have to go out and fertilize a different segment. I'm not entirely sure. But they self-fertilize, make worms, or sorry, make eggs, and to help continue the cycle. So there's some pictures. I thought these are some really nice pictures. Kind of reminds me of some science fiction movies, you know, they're kind of terrifying. But you know, there are other scarier worms. These ones here, maybe not as scary as some looking, but like I said, mostly gross. Okay, so let's talk about that pork tapeworm. Okay, it's very, very similar to the beef tapeworm, except for now we're talking about pigs instead of cows, right? So you can see the life cycle starts the same way. Somebody's eating some undercooked meat. In this case, it's pork instead of beef, and so the human is the definitive host, which means that the worm grows to an adult inside the human, and the worm is going to self-fertilize. It's going to make eggs. The eggs are going to get released through defecation, and then the eggs are eaten by the pig, and the cycle kind of continues. So there are some differences here. Okay, first thing to know is that the pork tapeworm is actually smaller. I think it's more like 3 to 4 meters max as opposed to 5 to 10 meters max. And the heads are a little bit different. But other than that, the life cycle is very similar. Now, the thing to consider here is that a human and a pig are both omnivores. And our digestive systems are in some ways very, very similar. So you can see this is talking about the human as the definitive host and the pig as the intermediate host. Sometimes the human can be the intermediate host. So you can imagine in some situations, here's a human, he or she is infected and is producing eggs, and the eggs come out in the feces, and then another human or the same human eats those eggs. So people with the pork tapeworm can self-infect themselves. These eggs, you know, we're wiping our butts, and you got eggs, and these eggs are actually these parasite eggs are very, very sticky. Not washing hands properly, or even washing hands properly, but the eggs, like I said, are very, very sticky, and they can actually ingest them themselves. Or sometimes you can get someone else infected, right? Like there was a case a number of years ago. There was a Jewish family in New York who were infected with this tapeworm. And of course, the question is what's going on here, because culturally, Jewish people don't usually eat pork. So in that case, it turned out that it was actually the cook had been infecting the family. And so that was the case that happened. So what happens here is we can eat the eggs, and we're similar enough to a pig, our digestive systems anyway, that it thinks it's in a pig, and the larvae will hatch. The eggs will hatch, and they will burrow around in human tissue, and they can get in all sorts of tissues. If it's in the muscle, it's not usually a big deal. It just turns into a cyst, and it's not really causing too much damage. But if it gets into the eye or the heart or the brain, it can cause some serious issues. So this condition is called cysticercosis. So cyst for meaning lump, and like I said, in some cases can be quite dangerous. I'll show you some pictures. There's somebody who's hugely infected. Most people don't get that many worms in them, but you can see all over the muscle tissues show up on x-rays. Sometimes people get them in the brain. This is called neurocysticercosis. And this is apparently relatively common worldwide. If you ever watch that medical show House, I don't think it's on Netflix anymore, but I used to watch it. And the very first episode, the pilot episode, they're trying to figure out what's wrong with this woman. And they didn't want to do some invasive brain scans, and you know, they thought it was cancer and all that. And in the end, it turned out it was a cyst from a worm. Someone is asking, are the worms in the cyst still viable? Yes, they're little larvae. They're little immature stages, and they're just basically encased there, and they're living on the tissues. And like I said, unfortunately, if it ends up in the brain, that's a really bad thing to have happen to you. Okay, so we'll move on from tapeworms. There are other tapeworms out there that can infect humans. Usually they're involved in other organisms. So like the fish tapeworm is a bear fish thing. Sometimes humans get it. There's a dog tapeworm that sometimes humans get, and so we're kind of accidental hosts, but they can cause illness. Oh, here's a map. You can see it's showing the prevalence of neurocysticercosis. Again, you know, you're looking at you know, mostly developing countries, places that might use human feces as fertilizer. And countries that don't, this kind of disease is relatively rare. And obviously places that are going to actually have pigs, right? So you notice, for example, the Middle East, a lot of Arab countries are not, people are not eating pork in those countries usually. And so it's going to be a lot more rare as an occurrence. Okay, so I want to talk about another kind of flatworm called flukes. Flukes are kind of loosely related to tapeworms. They usually have kind of a leaf-like shape, and there's a whole bunch of different types of flukes out there. The good news for us is most flukes are not normally found in Canada as well. Usually they have something to do with certain types of animals that are found locally. One of the most common ones here is called the liver fluke, or sometimes called the Asian liver fluke. Usually in the name, at least the common name, it tells you what it's infecting. So in this case here, it's infecting the liver. And you can see there's some notes here about how it has these suckers and it attaches onto tissues and feeds on human tissues. So let me show you how the life cycle of these flukes work, at least the liver flukes. So you can see in this case here, this is involving some sort of fish, involving some sort of snail, and involving humans. So if you want to start the life cycle of the humans, again, the human is releasing releasing it in their feces. They're releasing the eggs hatch, and they parasitize these snails. The snails are eaten by the fish, the human eats the fish. And again, here you have a situation is where somebody is not eating a cooked fish. And so this is really, really common in Asia. You know, people love sushi. And so, you know, this is a risk for eating sushi. In Canada, not usually. In Canada, we flash freeze the meat. So it's not, it's going to kill the parasites. But in a lot of Asian countries, fishermen, it's very common for them to be out fishing on their boats, and they catch the fish, and it's just part of their culture where while they're on the boat, they cut open the fish and they're eating the meat raw right then and there because that's the freshest and the best time to eat it. And of course, unfortunately, putting themselves to risk for these fluke parasites. There's another picture of one, and so I think I actually have a specimen here of a liver fluke. Let me just take a look here what I have. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the screen sharing so that I'm back to the video. How do I do that? There's got to be an end share button. Oh, there we go, stop share. Okay, so I'm going to just show you, I have some flukes here. This one here is not really well labeled, but I'm just going to hold that up. And you can see these ones here are kind of this, they're flat, they're like little beans, and they're kind of the shape of leaves. And that one, again, I'm not sure where that one's from. There's a lot of flukes that you find in animals. I have one more to show you. I was looking for some of the parasites in the biology lab, and unfortunately, I can't seem to find them all. Here's this one here is the Chinese liver fluke. So this one's really tiny. I don't know how, if you can try to hold it up there. Let's see here. The best angle is. So it's very, very tiny. It's right, kind of like right there. So very small. Some of these are really large. Some of them are really small. But they're all kind of creepy. We'll just say that. Okay, so I just gotta reshare the PowerPoint. There we go. So what kind of symptoms are we looking at? They're infecting the liver. So we're expecting, you know, some gastrointestinal kind of symptoms. We're expecting jaundice and things like that. I don't think these infections are usually, sometimes they're serious, but in many cases, people are just getting ill. In some cases violently, but not usually life-threatening. Again, we're looking at something that's geographically, there's a geographical range to this, mostly because of the snails, right? The snails are not found everywhere worldwide. They're found in various parts of Asia. But these flukes are important. They're infecting many people worldwide. These liver flukes, in fact, are very common in wildlife. You can see here's another case of a fluke infecting a goat. And all these flukes seem to involve some sort of snail or some sort of invertebrate as well as a vertebrate. So by the way, if you know anybody who hunts, I know there's lots of people in town that like to hunt deer or moose, and that could be you, could be someone that you know. Ask them to dissect the liver and see if there's any flukes in there. Apparently this is really common to see with moose and deer hunters. You know, they're cutting open the animal and wow, look at that. There's a big parasite inside the liver. And there's some right there showing this is, somebody found this one in BC. But you can Google it too. You can ask about parasites people see while hunting. Very, very interesting stuff. So there are lots of other flukes out there. By the way, there's also the lung fluke. So I'm not asking you to know all these life cycles of the flukes, by the way, but you should know that they almost always involve some sort of snail. And they almost always involve another organism as well, including the humans. So in this case, you can see this is some sort of crayfish or lobster, it looks like. And this one here, kind of the same type of life cycle. You've got eggs being released in the feces. Eventually the larva parasitize a snail, and then it leaves the snail, or sort of gets eaten by the crayfish, and then the human is eating the crayfish, and probably again in this case you're not cooking it properly, and causing the symptoms. There's also the blood fluke. This one is very important in certain parts of Africa. In this case here, actually, there is no other host. It's humans and snails. I'll show you a picture. It's a little bit graphic. Somebody drew this. I found this on the internet. Somebody drew this as part of a little project. You can see we've got the human coming out of the poop, going to the snails. And then wanted to show you that little larva there, because I forgot to mention in the other slides, these little larvae, sometimes the snail doesn't have to get eaten. In some species, the larva actually leaves the snail, and I'm looking at this little thing right here, and it's this little swimming thing. And what it does is it kind of swims along and finds the tissue of the next organism, and it can actually burrow into the skin of humans. So you can see in this case here, what they're showing is that human feces ends up in some sort of swimming hole, it looks like, and it parasitizes the snail, and then the larva finds the next human who happens to be swimming there and becomes infected, and the cycle continues. Okay, so there is one fluke that we do care about in Canada because it's transmitted in Canada. I guess that's on the next slide, but I just want to show you these numbers. Like I said, these numbers are pretty significant disease burden in a lot of developing countries. And so they are important to learn a little bit about. So the one fluke that we care about in Canada is the one that causes something called swimmer's itch. So how does swimmer's itch work? Well, it turns out that this is a duck snail thing, right? So we have the duck is releasing the eggs in the feces, and it's parasitizing the snail. It leaves the snail. You can see this little swimmer thing, and and there it is. It's got a tail, and it's going to burrow into the duck skin, and it's going to be a duck snail kind of thing going on. But of course, sometimes humans are out there and we're swimming, and we go to the lake, we go to the beach, And some summers, you know, are kind of the right conditions for this to be prevalent at the beach. And so I remember having this years ago, and you know, it wasn't very fun. You know, I got itchy. I was itchy for a good day or two. I remember getting some lotions my mom bought for me, and that was kind of the end of it. So what's going on here, right, is you've got these little larvae, and they're swimming along, and they're looking for a duck, and they find your leg, and they're like, hey, I found a duck. And then they penetrate into the human skin, and then they die because we don't have the same skin. Our chemistry is not the same as the duck chemistry. But at that point, it's too late for the parasite. The parasite is dead, but it causes itchiness, right? It's something getting into your skin. Some people have it really bad. Some people, kind of mild cases. Some people develop allergies to these things, and they end up with very, very, very bad cases. In my case, I remember it was just on my legs, so I think below the knees, it wasn't a big deal. But of course, if you get it all over your body, it can be very, very uncomfortable. So sometimes you go swimming, you see warnings about swimmer's itch, and like I said, you know, generally warmer seasons, and you know, when the ducks are around. It's not always ducks, there's other waterfowl as well. There's a word for you. Some people I've learned do not know this word. Waterfowl. Waterfowl means aquatic birds. So we've got ducks, we've got swans and geese and cormorants and loons. There's all sorts of waterfowl. Seagulls, I think in some cases, can actually transmit swimmer's itch as well. So again, usually not life-threatening, but something that can be very, very uncomfortable. Okay, so I have a Kahoot for you. So load up the app, and we can see how you fare on a few questions. Okay, let me just get it ready here. Okay, I just got to share the screen, I think. Okay, there it is. I'll give you a minute to join. Okay, I'll give you another 10 seconds to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, here we go. Fungi and worms. Question 1, ringworm is? And good job, 29 people got the right answer. Ringworm is a fungal infection. So remember, the ring part is describing the what the rash looks like, and worm is just a misnomer. It shouldn't be called a ringworm because it's not a worm. Okay, good job, Naomi. Watch out for Shelby. Question 2, a yeast is a multicellular fungi. And the answer is false. No, yeast are unicellular, not multicellular. Okay, scores getting mixed up a little bit. Good job. Question 3, which of the following is an example of a definitive host? Okay, so the answer's split on that one. The right answer is the mosquito. So what's the definitive host? The definitive host is where the organism is reproducing sexually. So in the case of the cow or the beef and pork tapeworm, the answer would be the human. So the right answer here is actually the mosquito. The mosquito salivary glands is where the Plasmodium parasite is reproducing sexually. Okay, let's see how the score table works. Helen, looks like Helen's on fire apparently. Good stuff. All right, last question for now. Flukes are parasitic flatworms which possess life cycles that includes both vertebrates and invertebrates. True or false? And the answer is true. What's a vertebrate and an invertebrate? Vertebrates are things with spines, so that might include humans or goats or deer. Invertebrates are things without spines, so that would include the snails. Okay, let's see how the score table comes down. In third place, Jared. Second place, Dylan. In first place, is it Helen? Helen! Way to go! Yeah! Woohoo! All right. Okay. Let's go back to PowerPoint. What's going on here? There we go. Okay, so back to our worms. I want to talk about, just make sure we have some volume here. There we go. Oops, sorry about that. What's going on here? There we go. Okay, we're going to talk about nematodes. So to introduce nematodes, we have SpongeBob. So let me play the SpongeBob clip for you here.
Plain face of the Kahoot.
Oh, somebody's saying the Kahoot sound is still on, so I will see if I can deal with that. Okay, I will just exit off. There we go. Hopefully that's better. So hopefully you heard this video here. I'm not sure. Like I said, I'm having some computer glitches today, but these little worms, they were running along, and I'll just skip ahead, and they're you can see that there's somebody driving along in his boat, and these worms eat it, and he says, "Oh, dang nematodes." So a little bit of SpongeBob for you. So what is a nematode? A nematode is a non-segmented roundworm. So this is often what people think of when they think of worms, like earthworms. You know, they are not segmented. They don't have little sections. They come in many sizes. Some of the biggest ones are like 1 meter in length. Some are free living. That means they live in the soil and things like that. And many are parasitic as well. And you see tons of nematodes infecting animals out in the animal kingdom. Again, something that you may have experienced if you have a cat or dog. Maybe they're getting worms of some sort. There's many types of parasites that our pets have been known to get. So like I said, same thing with hunters as well. Sometimes they find worms in the guts of the animals that are being killed. So there's a whole bunch of these. We're just going to talk about 3. Okay. One of them, the pinworm, is very common everywhere worldwide. The other 2 are a little bit more common in developing countries. So we'll talk about those in a minute here. So the first one to mention are the pinworms. So the Enterobius vermicularis. So they look like little pins. You can see that's why they're called pinworms. And so what's the story with pinworms? Pinworms are a human parasite, and they are they're spreaded fecally orally. So the eggs come out in the bum, and people will digest them in the mouth. and they're generally a kid-only thing. For some reason, the chemistry of the adult gut when people start to hit puberty is not a good home for pinworms. There are some cases where adults do get pinworms, but it's pretty rare. It's mostly kids. And here's the scary, crazy thing about this, is that some of the research seems to indicate that 100% of kids get these at some point. They're that common. Again, you've got a situation where you've got a parasite with sticky eggs and you know, kids, their hygiene isn't as good. They're not washing their hands. They can get them at school, daycare, wherever. You know, kids have itchy bums, and it happens quite frequently. In most cases, it's not serious enough that people even know or get it treated. In some cases, it is serious, and then, you know, people are not serious enough that it's causing discomfort. And again, it's just some medication. I noticed earlier somebody made a comment about putting tape on kids' bums. And this is often actually what doctors will ask, you know, the parents to do. You know, around bedtime, around nighttime is when the worms might start to migrate out. And so, you know, you might go into your child's bed when he or she is sleeping, get a little piece of, you know, clear Scotch tape, you know, put it right on the bum, and see if you can collect some worms and bring that to the doctor for diagnosis. So, you know, every once in a while, I'll have a student that will be like, they're thinking to themselves, and then they have this memory of maybe when they were 5 years old and their parents were in their bed with a flashlight at nighttime, and the student is like horrified thinking, wait a second, that was me. My parents were there and they were putting tape on my bum. So I see there's a comment, somebody said they had to do that, probably for your child, I'm guessing. And like I said, usually, you know, it's not usually a serious disease, just extreme itching. In some cases, a lot of kids do never get diagnosed, though the research seems to show that they probably had it if you look at things like antibodies. So pinworms, that's a good one to know. That's a Canadian worldwide thing. It seems that all humans get it. And thankfully, assuming we're all adults here, we're not going to get it again. So I'm happy about that. Okay, so let's talk about hookworms. I think these ones are scary. These ones are absolutely terrifying. If you look at all these pictures of hookworms, they just look like something off of a really scary science fiction movie, and I'm sure they've inspired more than one science fiction movie. So let's talk about hookworms because they're very, very important worldwide. Maybe 500 million cases, if I remember correctly, of hookworms. There are 2 species. The main one is this one here, this Necator americanus. Although you know, we do believe it actually originated in Africa, but it was discovered in the Americas. So what's going on with these? Why are they called hookworms? Because they actually kind of hook at the end, and they look like that. And here again, we have something that is spread in human feces. And in this case here, the worms will actually crawl. So in a lot of developing countries where sanitation is not so good and there are children running around bare feet, they are susceptible to hookworms. And the biggest concern about hookworms, so they'll burrow into the skin, eventually end up in the digestive tract, but they also infect the blood and they can cause anemia. So this can be very, very serious type of infection to get, because when people get anemia, they can get very sick. It can actually affect a child's IQ, which is very, very bad. So that's hookworms. I think I have another picture or two. Some notes there. Oh yeah, okay. So notice this this system here. This is actually part of the life cycle of a lot of these worms. It's really kind of gross, but if you think about these worms, right, they're trying to get to a certain part of the body. In the case of the hookworm, it's actually trying to get to the intestine. So how do you get to the intestine if you're burrowing into the skin? So the way they do this is they get into the blood, and then they travel, and we have a circulatory system, right? And eventually it ends up in the lungs. So these worms actually end up in the lungs at some point, and sometimes and then they get to the intestine by basically coming, you know, up of the windpipe and down the esophagus, and often the person doesn't even know that's happening. And that's actually the case with a lot of these worms, is they will do that, and sometimes they can cause lung infections and different types of pneumonia. So hookworms is something you definitely do not want to get. Again, thankfully, we've got good sanitation in Canada and not usually a concern. But we do get imported cases sometimes. Another worm that is important worldwide, and we're looking at, we don't even know, probably 1 billion cases, maybe 2 billion cases worldwide. And this is called Ascaris. And I'm going to just go back to my video here and show you, because I have some right here. So I'll hold that up and nice and close. So you can see these kind of almost look like beans. They're about the size of like a pen, like a Bic pen. And so sometimes people call these giant intestinal roundworms. So let's go back to my PowerPoint. Uh-oh, what did happen on my PowerPoint? There it is. So I know I have some pictures here, and there's a picture of the Ascaris. So sometimes they're a little bit more yellow looking. Sometimes they look a little bit more like earthworms, but they're kind of in that general size. So you can see the note here. It says you've got the pretty similar scenario. You get eggs from feces, and those eggs end up in the soil, and then they end up on unwashed food, right? So again, another situation where we have human waste is being used as fertilizer. Maybe I'll just make a point about human waste being used as a fertilizer. You know, like I said, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually, it's very rich and it's free. And so that's actually a good scenario for a lot of people worldwide. But what needs to be done to do it properly is the waste needs to be composted or cured first. Where a lot of these worms here, like these Ascaris worms, they only live something like a week out in the wild. So without a human, if the waste is cured and composted for, you know, let's say 2 weeks, then that's going to get rid of most parasites. And that's something that a lot of developmental kind of organizations like World Vision and organizations like that try to train people to do, is to say, yeah, sure, you're going to use your waste as fertilizer, but you know, compost it properly and you'll get rid of a lot of disease. So there's the life cycle, kind of similar again. Somebody will eat it, you know, as part of unwashed food, and it actually doesn't quite make it to the intestine right away. It actually does the same thing the hookworm is it goes up, you know, through the lungs and in the back of the throat before it ends up in the intestine in the end, which is like kind of weird because you're already eating it, but I'm not really sure why it does that. I'm going to show you some gross pictures, so just a little warning if your stomach is weak. And I know we have a couple minutes left. I'm just going to finish up with Ascaris. I'll show you some pictures of what it looks like. So some people, most people, if you have, you know, let's say 10 or 20 of these worms, it's not usually a big deal. You know, yeah, they're taking some nutrients and they're doing a few things like that, but people are not usually ending up with serious symptoms. I see there's somebody has a question, but I can't seem to access the chat. Oh, somebody says spaghetti. But if you have like 100 or 200, now you're starting to get some intestinal blockage, which is where we can have some issues. I was going to show you this other picture here. This was a photograph done by a parasitologist, and he went to, I'm trying to think which country he went to. I think it was Honduras, and he went to this village, and this village had about 100 kids. And he gave every kid 1 pill of ivermectin and collected what they had. And every single kid, 100% of the kids in this village were infected with Ascaris. So this is super, super common. Now, being a parasitologist, of course, he collected them, put them in a bottle. So fun, fun, fun. Okay, so just some warning here. Like I said, some graphic pictures. You can see that note. It says they can exit from the anus, nose, mouth, or ears. So sometimes kids will get other illnesses, and they run a fever, and the worms don't like fevers, and so they start to move around and they're looking for exits. So I'll show you some pictures here. Here's a pig intestine that's looking pretty blocked up. So graphic warning, just I warned you. So here's some pictures of exactly that scenario where the worms are trying to get out because somebody has a fever or something like that. Okay, so like I said, you know, the biggest issue with Ascaris is intestinal blockage, which can be painful or debilitating in some ways, and so sometimes drugs or surgery are required in order to get rid of the worms. Okay, there's a note here. Maybe I'll come back to that one next day. I think I'm going to stop there for today. Not quite done. This unit we'll carry it up over next week. So that's probably the most disturbing of all the photos for you. But just some things to think about, right? Cook your meat, compost your fertilizer before using it, and you know, things will be okay. Most of these things are not serious infections. They can be treated. In Canada, we have free health care, and but they are concerns worldwide. You know, where the health care is not as good, and these infections are a lot more common. So it's worth it to know a little bit about some of these worms and parasites. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today. So hopefully you enjoyed the lecture. I was hoping I had some tapeworms. I can't seem to find them in the lab to show you guys, but hopefully those pictures were nice enough. So have a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you next week.